I genuinely would like to be able to say that I thought this bill was going to make any difference at all in improving the lot of those who are looking for private rented accommodation, or who are in private rented accommodation, or who are facing eviction or have been evicted from private rented accommodation through no fault of their own. But tragically, there is really nothing at all in this bill that is going to make the slightest bit of difference to the people who are affected by the absolutely dire crisis that we face in private rented accommodation and in just generally access to some kind of affordable roof over the heads of huge numbers of people who need that, but are having great difficulty in securing it. 2%, limiting further increases in rent to 2% or to the rate of inflation, whichever is lower, is just hopelessly, it's worse than inadequate. It is worse than useless against a background of rents that are already completely unaffordable. And I don't know how many times we have to say it. I can't actually believe that the government doesn't know this. I mean, they see the same rent figures we have, and I presume they have constituents just like I have. So they must know that if rents in Dublin are €2,000, that means the vast majority of people cannot afford them. In my area, they're 2,200 on average and rising. So that means you'd need after-tax income of €26,000 to pay the rent, just to pay the rent in my area, based on average rents. Or 24,000 in most of Dublin. So that's what is that, 70% of the after-tax income of an average worker, of the average industrial wage? I mean, how does the government think this is sustainable? And then we're going to allow for further increases in that, even if they're capped at 2%. It is just hopelessly inadequate. And it does nothing to address the primary reason why people find themselves in housing emergencies or actually homeless. Because the vast majority of people who find themselves evicted through no fault of their own are not as a result of the duration of the Part 4 tenancy. That is not the reason most people who find themselves threatened with eviction or actually made homeless find themselves in that situation. The vast majority of people who find themselves threatened with eviction or actually made homeless find themselves in that situation because the landlord is allowed to evict them on grounds of sale or on grounds of substantial refurbishment, or because they say they need to move a family member into the home. That is the reason. And I will be impressed with the government's efforts, or even take seriously the government's efforts to address the crisis facing tenants, or those who want to be tenants but can't find anywhere affordable, when I stop seeing day in, day out, week in, week out, the trail of human misery and suffering that walks into my clinic. Week in, week out, the same terrible story of people coming in and saying, my landlord is saying they're selling up, what am I going to do? I simply can't find somewhere that is affordable. All of the rents in my area are well in excess of the HAP limits, the maximum HAP limits, even the homeless HAP limits, where the maximum payment you can get for homeless HAP is €1,900, but as I said, average rents are about 2,200. You just can't find anything, even with the uplift of homeless HAP. So if you find yourself threatened with eviction because a landlord says they're going to sell or substantial refurbishment or move a relative in, you are by definition, in my area at least, and in most of Dublin, you are by definition in a housing emergency, and you are by definition threatened with the very, very real possibility of homelessness. And just the fear that people express with kids or individuals or families, the fear when they come down to my office and they say, what are my options? Go down and register with Dún Laoghaire Down homeless section, and when they go down there, they are told, we might be able to get you a hostel somewhere in town, somewhere in the city centre. And just the fear people have of going into shared accommodation, hostels in town, often where they have kids going to school in our area. How on earth am I going to, are my kids going to manage in that accommodation? How am I going to get to them to school in the morning? I will never forget the day a young woman, let's say she was about 19, came into my office and said, I have been homeless all my life. All my life. I couldn't believe it when she said it to me. She was about 20. Her name was Kaylee. I brought her case up here a few years ago. And what she meant by that was she was born into a situation where her mother was homeless. Her mother remained homeless for all the time that Kaylee was brought up with her. And then when Kaylee, if you like, came of age to try and go independent, and she was at school and indeed going to college, she then became homeless. So she went from being homeless with her mother to being homeless herself. Never in all her years having a secure place to live. I mean, imagine that. Imagine that. Now, that's a particularly extreme story, but I'm not exaggerating one iota, Minister, when I say that I see people in dire situations, if not that extreme, not that far off it, day in, day out, with parents, with kids, absolutely terrified at the prospect of being made homeless. So this is just not good enough. It's just not good enough. It's not serious at all. I don't actually really see what you actually think you're going to achieve with this. But it is not going to touch the crisis that affects my area, and I don't think most of the places, it's not going to touch the crisis that faces most of the areas where the rental crisis and the housing and homelessness crisis are most acute. So what do we need to do? Well, we saw some of what could be done, because it was done in particular emergency conditions in the first phase of the pandemic, where the government had to, in order to get buy-in from the public in the face of the pandemic, with the lockdown measures, had to introduce a freeze on evictions, prevent evictions, and a complete freeze on further rent increases. Prior to the pandemic, we'd heard government after government, housing minister after housing minister saying it couldn't be done, that they had advice from the Attorney General that it wasn't possible, it was unconstitutional, and lo and behold, faced with the pandemic, it could be done. It was done, and it had a positive impact. And the result was the number of families and individuals in homelessness fell. Just as those of us who'd argued for a freeze on evictions prior to the COVID pandemic, faced with the more general housing crisis, said it would. And it did. The number of people forced into homelessness self-evidently fell because evictions were no longer possible. Because that's where the majority of people who are driven into homelessness come from. They come from the private rented sector. They are evicted by landlords who sell, substantially refurbish, or decide to move a relative in. And when that was no longer a grounds for a brief period in the first phase of the pandemic for evicting people, lo and behold, the number of people thrown into the misery of homelessness reduced. And similarly, that increases on rents were frozen. So people weren't faced with the prospect of rising rents that they couldn't pay. And indeed, it's well worth saying in my area, insofar as people can get HAP tenancies at all, given that the HAP limits, as I mentioned earlier on, are completely inadequate to actually cover the cost of the extortionate rents in my area, most people have to pay top-ups beyond what they would have to pay if they were in a proper differential rent in a council house. They have to pay further top-ups that they simply cannot afford, getting themselves often deeper and deeper into financial trouble because they are paying levels of rent that they simply can't manage, and getting themselves in debt or arrears, and then finding themselves faced with the possibility of eviction if they do get into arrears. And all of this is sanctioned. It's now official. It used to be unofficial that the council would say, oh, quietly, you can top up. You can top up on the HAP. We know the HAP's not enough, you can top up, but now it's official. You fill out a form saying top up to pay rents that you can't actually afford. And lo and behold, people get into serious trouble, and often so much trouble from a financial point of view that they can't pay the rent and end up threatened with homelessness. But as I said, during the pandemic, we showed if you freeze completely any further increases in rent and prevent evictions on the grounds that they are currently allowed for, in which the majority of people who find themselves faced with no-fault evictions, if you remove those grounds, less people end up in housing emergencies, less people end up homeless. And of course, as soon as the government reintroduced the right to have rent increases and lifted the eviction ban, more and more people started to go homeless, and we see the figures begin to rise. I mean, it really is as simple as that, combined, of course, with the continual raising of rents to, what is it, 7% nationally, according to the RTB, over the last year, on top of the already unaffordable levels. So that's the minimum that is required in order to give some security for people in the current situation of utterly unaffordable rents and the possibility always around the corner that you could be evicted on the grounds that I mentioned. But that doesn't go far enough, in my opinion. And this is where people before profit will go further, even than any of the opposition parties are suggesting. We think, given that rent levels are completely unaffordable, we need to set rents, reset rents at affordable levels. And that is done in some countries. So, for example, in Luxembourg, the rent can only be a certain percentage of the capital investment in the property. Now, I'm not saying that's the perfect model, but it's a sort of cost rental, if you like, in the private sector. So that it limits the amount of profit that the landlord can make and the amount which they can charge in rent based on the investment the landlord has made in the property. In other places, rents are set on the basis of particular geographical areas and setting rents at a level that is considered affordable. And that is what we need to do. And in fact, if we do not do that, we will not get an affordable rental sector. Now, I should say that in and of on its own, even that measure, which I think we should and have to take, won't solve the entire crisis because, of course, as I'm sure the Minister will be quick to say, we need supply. And we certainly do need supply in the market because there simply isn't enough supply. But the point about relying on supply largely from the private sector is that the people who build rental property for profit have absolutely no interest in rents falling. Why on earth would they build properties to rent if they thought the result of building those properties was that rents would fall and their profit margin would reduce. They simply won't do it. They will only build them if they can make large profits. If there's any suggestion that the profits will decline, then they will stop investing. And that is the folly of relying on the private sector in order to solve the housing crisis and the rental crisis. So, of course, what is necessary is on a far, far greater scale than this government is willing to, or any of the recent governments have been willing to consider. We need to return to the direct provision by the state of affordable rental accommodation. In other words, council housing. That is genuinely affordable, based on a proportion of your income. And much as the government says that they are moving back towards this, I actually don't believe them. I don't believe them. You see, I think there is a reason why we have been asking for 4 years for a review of the income thresholds for eligibility for social housing, and the government have kept saying there's going to be a review, but the review never arrives. Why is that? Why is it for 4 years they haven't reviewed upwards the income thresholds? And the reason is because they are intending to reduce down the social housing sector to being a sector where social housing is only provided for people on the lowest of low incomes. That's the plan. No question about it. It's obviously convenient in terms of reducing the numbers on the housing lists, because each year, as people's incomes creep up, you can lop another few hundred, another few thousand off the list. Now that has reached the ridiculous proportions that people, even in homeless accommodation, and we're dealing now with 4 cases in my area of people who are actually in homeless accommodation who are being evicted from the homeless accommodation because their incomes, because they're working, they're trying to get themselves out of their situation, and their work takes their income over the income threshold, but they still can't afford anywhere to live. They're in homeless accommodation, and so they are threatened with homelessness from homeless accommodation. I mean, it simply beggars belief, but that's where we've got to because of the refusal to raise the income thresholds. But I think that is an absolutely deliberate strategy, and when you put in parliamentary questions to the Minister about this, there's a sort of coded phrase which is we are going to target social housing at the most vulnerable and those most in need. That is code for saying we're only going to make social housing available to people on the lowest incomes from now on, as against historically where social housing was made available to a very, very broad spectrum of working people. Basically the income thresholds are such it is only available to the people on the absolute lowest incomes. And I believe that is absolutely deliberate, and I think the government's plan is essentially to replace the historic provision of social housing with cost rental. Now, cost rental is better than the open market, but it's still not anywhere near as good as social housing in terms of a fixed proportion of your income, which is manageable as your rent, which adjusts according to your income rising. Cost rental links your rent to the cost of building the house, and therefore it's more expensive. So the first cost rentals that have been delivered in my area, €1,200 a month. Cheaper than the 2,200, but still shockingly expensive and completely unaffordable for huge numbers of people who are now no longer eligible for social housing because their income is over the limit, but they still can't afford €1,200 a month. I rang up a council worker who I know was looking to get, he would knocked off the list, working in the council, outdoor worker, low wages, knocked off the list because he did a sort of semi-permanent overtime on a Saturday, which he couldn't really get out of. That knocked him off the list. He'd been on it for 10 years. I rang him up when the cost rental came up on Enniskerry Road, and I said, this might be for you, this might actually work, €1,200. I was thinking in my head, Jesus, 1,200 doesn't sound too bad compared to 2,200. And he said, you must be joking. I couldn't afford 1,200. Are you kidding me? On my income. And he explained what his wages were as a council worker. Right? So that is not good enough. We need to set rents at levels that are affordable based on the income of average and low-paid workers, and we need to provide the state itself directly much of that because the private rented for-profit sector is incapable of delivering it.
Thank you very